Okay, hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for coming. Welcome to Obvious. I'm Padmini. I'm head of communications here. We just wanted to tell you that there are just a few housekeeping rules to observe. The bathrooms are to your left, and there's coffee and tea and water. Please help yourself during the course of the conversation. We have a code of conduct that will be enforced during the event. In case you want to take a look at it, it's on our playbook, which is available at the link on top. If you need anything, do just come and talk to me. Otherwise, enjoy the event. And I think we're going to focus. Gautam's going to talk maybe a little less than he anticipated he will, because we think that we need more time for discussion and questions and answers. So that's probably going to be the way that we're going to do it. So yeah, I'll just hand over to Kiran, who is from Housekeeping, hosting this event. Thank you.
Yeah. So I'm actually hosting this event on behalf of the partner community. We are a group of people from technical and legal backgrounds who have been working on decoding how technology intersects with the law. And Gautam's been part of the group for a couple of years now at least. Yeah. And Gautam's been a huge source of understanding of how to interpret the law for all those of us coming from a technical background. And so that's something I want to understand. How many of you are from a technical background? Okay. And how many from a legal background? Okay. And how from other backgrounds? So there's design, there's marketing in the back over there. I'm sure there's a huge diversity of it. Yeah, music. Okay. So part of what we're going through in our modern society is used to think of the law as being somewhat remote while we went about our day-to-day lives. And the law was just something to be afraid of because you would get caught crossing the road when you're not supposed to cross and then you pay a fine or something trivial like that. And over the last few years, at least for us in the tech community, realize that our work intersects a lot more than we are comfortable with, and a lot more that we have awareness of, and therefore the software that we write has consequences for human rights that we did not see coming and we did not know how to think about at all. So part of what the current community has been trying to do over the last couple of years is bring that awareness into mainstream society. And obviously, we don't do this by saying, here is something to read, but we try to do this by saying, go where people are already reading, which is mainstream publications. So if a journalist is writing about software problems and how they're affecting citizens, we try to help them understand what is this software in the first place and how is it affecting people in ways that may not yet be manifesting as problems. So that's one side of it. And Gautam, obviously, a constitutional scholar, has been helping us understand how to think about the law in the first place. And the books, I think, are fantastic reading. This is his second book. He's got another one on free speech. Both of them are really worth reading. I think Gautam is an incredibly good writer. He also has a blog on Indian constitutional law and philosophy. It's a blog that is both extremely readable and is also well read, in that you will find Supreme Court justices reading the blog to understand how their own verdicts are making sense outside of their own courts. Okay? So, Gautam, over to you.
Yeah, thanks. So, first of all, thank you to HasGeek for inviting me, and thank you to Obvious for this beautiful space. It feels very nice to be here. I should begin by also clarifying how I come to this whole issue. And so, around 2015-16, I was approached to help out with the Aadhaar litigation, the constitutional challenge to Aadhaar that was then pending in the Supreme Court. And over the next 3 years, I was heavily involved in research, in some drafting, in briefing lawyers to argue the case and so on. And that was when I began to understand the interface between technology and the law, and more specifically the Constitution and human rights. So that's how I came to all of this. And I should also therefore clarify that I am a lawyer and my background is legal. I'm not a technologist, and so obviously my expertise is not in that domain. And so I think at least what I will try to put across through the course of this discussion is to maybe bring to light some of the constitutional principles that I found coming up again and again in cases like Aadhaar and in other similar cases, and how I as a lawyer found the interface between technology and human rights to be. And perhaps that might give some of you ideas about how these principles, these values might be relevant in your work, and we could of course take that forward in the discussion. So I want to begin with a small anecdote that I came across very recently, although the broader context of that is something I've been reading about for a while now. And this story begins in Chile in 1968. Chile 1968 is when a man called Salvador Allende, who used to be a doctor working in rural areas, bringing medical services to poor people, finds himself the president of Chile at the head of the Socialist Party, and he's won the election. And this is the second attempt. He lost the first time. The second time he is successful. And one of Allende's first real goals is to mitigate the severe imbalance in the control of resources in Chile, because over the course of history, a few private players had basically captured ownership over most of the important natural resources in Chile. So Allende begins with nationalizing some of the important natural resources. But unlike the top-down socialist model that we've come to associate with nationalization, he doesn't stop there, and he doesn't think that that is what this project is about. Because what he's really keen to do and to bring, based on his experiences working as a doctor in rural areas, is to bring a genuine democratic participation in decisions about how resources are to be used, how factories should work, and so his idea of management is decentralized, and it envisions people having significant decision-making control over these kinds of activities, what we now know as the idea of industrial democracy. So, and the other unique thing about Allende is that he is very, very curious about technology. And so he combines these two interests, and he wants to use technology to implement his idea of a certain democratic decentralization of management and control. To do that, Allende's advisors approach an eccentric Englishman called Stafford Beer, who has been engaged in all kinds of ideas and writing about how tech can be used in management, and there's a theory called informational cybernetics that he pioneers in many books. And so they approach Stafford Beer, and Stafford Beer flies to Chile to advise Allende on how to develop this idea. And that becomes something called Project Cybersyn, and that is a photograph of the control room of Project Cybersyn back, and this is built in 1970, so much before the real explosion of tech and its omnipresence. So they build Project Cybersyn, and the way it's supposed to work is that you have a number of telex machines that connect individual factories to this control room, and you have inputs coming in from these factories on a regular basis about production data, figures, what's happening there, and then these are fed into economic models that give you information about what that means, and then decision makers sitting here have access to all these screens, and then they can take calls on whether something is going well or going badly, and so on. An interesting application of this was when Allende is severely disliked by the outgoing establishment, and so to attempt to bring down his government, they organize a strike of truck drivers to attempt to prevent resources from being transported across the country and therefore create a shortage. So Allende and his advisors use Project Cybersyn to understand where to bring the resources to at what times, and with the help of a small number of trucks, 200 trucks, they're able to break the 40,000 trucks that are part of the strike by strategically going to where resources are most needed. So that's one application this is put to. Now, the ending is not a happy one. So Allende is overthrown in a military coup in 1973, and General Pinochet takes power, and the first thing he does is to destroy Project Cybersyn. So that it ends without it ever actually being taken forward and genuinely becoming a model or a project. And Stafford Beer then also has to flee, and he has survivor's guilt for the rest of his life, and doesn't really do anything after that. That's how the story ends. But the really interesting anecdote I want to put out, could we have the next photo please, Is that, yeah. So when this is a photograph, an illustration from Stafford Beer's book, where he's basically connecting how the firm works and how the human body works, and he's selling the project to I&A using these diagrams. And so he's basically comparing the control room that you saw a few minutes ago to the brain and how the brain directs, the intelligence inputs of the body and directs various movements in the body. And so he's selling it to I&A using this illustration, and he's about to say that, look, this is how it's all going to work, and that brain there in that illustration, that's you. That's what he's going to tell him. Before he can say that, I&A leans back in his chair, smiles, looks at the brain and says, that's the people. And that, for Stafford Beer, is a moment of conversion, where a number of assumptions that he had held all his life about management, about control, about how the firm should work, in one line, in one sentence, in one illustration, are completely overturned. And later in life, when he's being interviewed about this project, he recalls that moment as being one of the most important moments of his life, where he understood exactly what I&A's project was about. And this whole idea of if you think of the brain as being one person in control, the tech that you're going to then use will be utilized in certain ways, certain assumptions. If you think of the brain as not being the president or the leader, but being the democracy, the demos, the people, you think of it very differently, and its use becomes very different. And in these small illustrations and in these small words, the entire idea changes. So that's the anecdote, I think, that at least has stuck with me since I came across it a few days ago, and for me it helped to clarify what was so unique and different about the project. And if you're of course interested, there are a lot of articles and a lot of scholarship on what this whole thing was about and where it might have gone had it not been terminated early by a military coup. And that's kind of the framework within which I want to have this discussion, that we often think of tech as being something neutral, external to the world, and its effects as being divorced from it. But often the effects come in the design itself and in the ideas that animate why we are doing what we are doing. So I want to start with two quotes that I've come across. I came across during the course of research for my book, the last chapter of which deals with some of these ideas. The first quote I came across was in a piece in Factor Daily, an interview with the CEO of a company called Face Tiger. I don't know if that company is still around and if it's going. So the CEO was talking about the uses of Face Tiger, and he says, and I'll quote, imagine a guy walking on the road at 2 a.m. who is looking suspicious. Police patrol can take the suspect's photograph with our app and within a second receive details of his crime history. This was in the context of the Chennai police using the app in a marketplace before a festival was going to happen. And the CEO obviously thought that this was a very useful thing to check crime and to ensure law and order in the streets and so on. That's the first quote, and I'll come back to that. The second quote is something that Shyam Devan, the leading lawyer for the petitioners in the Aadhaar case, said during the course of oral arguments in court. I was a few feet from him and I heard him say it, and it was quite a powerful moment. So when talking about Aadhaar and how Aadhaar resets the relationship between the individual and the state, Shyam Devan said that the Constitution is not a charter of servitude. Those were his lines. And I'd like to, at the end of this discussion, draw the link between these two quotes, which may not immediately seem obvious, but I think that there is a fundamental and important link. But I'll begin by unpacking what Shyam Devan said in a little more detail. So when he said that the Constitution is not a charter of servitude, what he meant was that the Constitution as an idea, as a document, as a vision, is fundamentally about power. It talks about the existing relations of power that exist in society, and it provides various pathways, various signposts, various methods to alter some of those relations of power. That comes across in various specific provisions, which we could talk about. It comes across most vividly in the 3 words that you find in the preamble, which is now becoming quite popular. It's being read out, in various protest gatherings. The three words that originally come from the French Revolution: liberty, equality, fraternity. In a very basic way, the idea of liberty is to increase freedom by constraining state power. The state, as we have found out in vivid terms recently, is a very, very powerful institution, and it can do a lot to all of us. So the idea of liberty, as enshrined in various constitutional provisions like the freedom of speech, the right to life, the right to personal liberty, the right to conscience, and so on, seeks to create a zone of freedom by putting limitations on the kinds of power the state can exercise upon you, and in the ways in which it can do so, and when it can't do so. The second idea, of course, is equality. And equality is also about power. So if you think about the long-lasting debate about reservations, good, bad, should we have them, should we not have them, it is fundamentally a question about how, over the last few centuries, relations of power have put certain kinds of barriers between people and access to very basic goods like education, public posts, and so on. And the vision of substantive equality that the Constitution subscribes to attempts to break those kinds of power relations by ensuring that access is now provided through even proactive and affirmative means, like, for example, reservations and other ideas that we could talk about. And the third idea is fraternity. In very basic terms, the relations between individuals without the state playing any part. And that idea comes from a unique Indian history where the state, despite being very powerful, was never the only or the sole center of power. There were always social institutions, cultural institutions that exercised as great and as severe a kind of domination and power over individuals. Caste, of course, is the most vivid example of that. And it's interesting that Ambedkar, one of the chief drafting people of the Constitution, one of his foremost political movements was for access to water from village drinking wells, because Dalits weren't allowed to use the same well as upper caste were. And Ambedkar framed this movement as about being the right to access public space. And that found its way into the Constitution through provisions like Article 15, Clause 2, that prohibits discrimination between private persons in access to shops, hotels, restaurants, other public spaces on grounds of caste, gender, and so on. So you have these three ideas: liberty, equality, and fraternity, each of which are concerned with the different kinds of power relations that exist in society. And the idea of the Constitution is to interrogate them, to undermine them, and to create a new kind of equation where democracy, which is the equalization of these relations, comes not just in the equation between the individual and the state, but also in private relations involving private persons, because the kinds of power that operate there are as serious as exist when the state is involved. So for many years after the Constitution, this entire idea of power revolved around access to physical spaces, to physical goods, reservations being the one example, surveillance of a very basic kind, watching your house and so on, that was often an issue. Sedition, all these ideas, they were set in the actual physical world. Now, over the last few years, what's happened is that the introduction of tech into this space, and therefore the connection between tech and the Constitution is that tech intervenes into these relations of power, and it could actually entrench some of them, perpetuate some of them, but also continue with the constitutional vision of undermining them, of democratizing them. So to understand how, let's come back to the face tagger quote, right? So just to reread the quote, imagine a guy walking on the road at 2 a.m. who is looking suspicious. A police patrol can take the suspect's photograph with our app and within a second receive details of his crime history. Now, I want to focus on four phrases here. The first is the phrase looking suspicious. If you think about it, you think about 2 a.m. at night walking down the street. Who is it that looks suspicious and to whom? In this case, obviously, this interview is given to a factor daily. The people who read it are people like you and me. So, who is it to us who looks suspicious? Now, if it's one of us, dressed like one of us, walking down, say, Church Street after a late night, that person wouldn't look suspicious to us. They would look, what we think of as normal. and so they would to the police as well, also the addressees of this interview. The people who look suspicious are people who don't look like us normally, who are not dressed like us, whom we think as perhaps being from a socioeconomic background that is not as elite as ours, and we think of them as perhaps being on the way to commit a crime or there for purposes that are not particularly healthy or good. And I'm recalling this incident just from yesterday, that there was that sting that India Today did about those attacks in JNU. And one of the people whom they interviewed said that he was going with his stick and he saw a person with a beard who looked Kashmiri, and so he went and beat him up. Right? So you can see how the very term looking suspicious is not a neutral term. It's all about who is doing the looking, the watching, and what looks suspicious to them, and what they're in a position to do about that. And in this case, obviously, it's the police who will, if they think someone looks suspicious, can take that photograph and upload that into the database. Right? So that's one thing. Second is the police patrol. Now, in which neighborhoods do you find police patrols? Where does the police go and patrol? These are questions of political geography. And if you do a study in any big city, you'll find that certain neighborhoods and certain areas receive far greater police scrutiny than others do. And these are along the lines of income, along the lines of class, and often along the lines of religion. Srinivas Kodli, who I'm sure you all know, is not here right now, has done a lot of research in Hyderabad and shown how in Muslim neighborhoods, police have these cordon searches where they just randomly go in and ask people to give their Aadhaar details. So the moment you mention the word police patrol, you automatically make certain assumptions of where the police is going to be. And in those neighborhoods, are the police thought of as protectors, as people who are meant to keep you safe, or are they thought of as invaders who are meant to cause you trouble? That changes depending on which neighborhood you're in. Look at the US, there's a lot of research on how you have what they call stop and search, where the police can stop you and search you if they think that in your car you might be carrying heroin or drugs, and there's a clear link between a black driver being stopped and searched, which happens far more than a white driver. So that also happens. The third, of course, is the suspect's photograph. Right? And when does the police feel entitled to just take a photograph of an individual without their consent and upload that? Presumably, again in Church Street, if you're walking down the street, they would be a little more hesitant before just taking a photograph and uploading that. A kind of hesitation that may not be that apparent in other neighborhoods. And of course, the last is crime history. And if you look at the statistics, and we'll come back to this later on, you will find that the prison population in India has a disproportionate representation of Dalits and Muslims. So the relevant correlation between the population that the Indian population has of Dalits and Muslims vis-a-vis the number of them in prison is very disproportionate. There's a far greater number of them in prison than actually in the population. And of course, a simple answer to that is that it could be because they commit more crimes. But if you go a little deeper, you will find that a lot of biases operate in the criminal justice system that result in this kind of a ratio. You see it a lot in the recent protests in UP, where the police themselves have admitted now that they have taken a whole bunch of people from Muslim neighborhoods that weren't involved in protests, so they just pick them up randomly. And these kinds of figures then inflate the prison population of these communities. So the moment you're uploading that photograph and checking against a crime history, you should know that the data that already came in and made the crime history itself is not free from all kinds of biases. And so you see how this seemingly straightforward statement of taking a photograph and uploading it into a crime history at 2 in the night on a road where somebody is walking and looking suspicious carries within it implicitly a whole host of assumptions, biases that can perpetuate already existing kinds of marginalization and vulnerabilities that exist in society along various fault lines. But once you have this app that does this, it's out of your control, right? The police will use it, and they will use it in the ways that they deem fit. And so, in the very design of the app, you have given the possibility of these kinds of uses which will then be magnified in the actual use. And if you want more examples of this, very vivid and concrete examples, there's a great book called Automating Inequality by Virginia Eubanks, and she takes the examples in the US of the housing market, for instance, of the decision of custody of children, and so on. And she shows how it's not that tech is itself creating problems, but if you have existing fault lines in society, then the use of tech can magnify those fault lines, or it can mitigate them. And that's where the key question arises. Now, I want to link back briefly the statement that the CEO of FaceTiger made with the Constitution, because I've talked about the problems that it creates. But what does the Constitution have to say about it? And let's begin with the idea of equality, because that's really at the heart of a lot of the debates around the interface between tech and the Constitution. Now, for a long time, we used to operate with a very narrow understanding of equality. The idea was that unequal treatment can only take place if there is an agent, a specific individual, who is doing that unequal treatment, and that agent has to be guided by malice, by bad motives, by bad reasons. So, right, okay, if a policeman deliberately and intentionally stops a person on the street because they are black, right, and searches them, that's discrimination, that's unequal treatment. But for that, you have to have a specific person, the policeman, doing that, and you have to show that the reason why he did that was because he's a racist, he doesn't like black people, because he's motivated by ill intent towards that race. That was the definition of equality in our understanding what unequal treatment means. Of course, a very narrow understanding. Over the last couple of decades, in the Indian constitutional context, over the last few years, in cases like the 377 case, which you all know about, and the privacy judgment, which also I'm sure you all know about, there's been a much more nuanced and evolved understanding of what equality means. And this is an understanding that no longer looks at inequality as being the result of individual choices to discriminate, individual malicious motives, individual racism, but as a function of design that goes into how our institutions operate and how our social structures operate. So this kind of an approach looks at not the reasons or the motivations underlying actions, but at the results or the effects of those actions. So if you find, for example, that in a workplace, the proportion of men to women far outnumbers the proportion in the larger population, that should give you an indication that something is wrong. You may, after detailed research, find that the reasons underlying that have nothing to do with gender disparity, but more often than not, you will find that actually they do. So, for instance, if a particular workplace does not have a pregnancy leave policy in place, then it will discourage a number of women from applying for the job in the first place. And then that will result in a skewed workforce. This is a very basic and simple example. But of course, inequality can have many more nuances that are not as basic as this. So this understanding of inequality takes into account, first of all, a long history where there was a prior history of intentional discrimination, which has now been done away with, but whose effects still persist. The philosopher Bernard Williams had a very interesting example where he talked about how imagine a society in which only a certain class of people can become soldiers. Right? Informally in law, you have that discrimination written into the law. Now, at some point, you remove that, and so now formally it's all equal. Anyone can apply for the army. But you also find that over the years, because the army is revered in the society, those who were in the army, people of a certain class, had access to the best kind of healthcare, the best kind of access to the most nutritious diets, all of that. And so now you have a seemingly formally equal test, but you also find that only those people who are already in the army are now in the position to make use of the neutral criteria you have put in place, say a physical test and so on. And so obviously you have to go beyond just neutrality and ask yourselves, what is the underlying reason for the effect being unequal. So look at the historical reasons, look at how institutions work, unquestioned norms, unquestioned biases, and look at the effects. And then in that sense, you get a much broader idea of what equality means and requires. And so when you come back to the face tagger example, what you find is that under the old and narrow view of inequality, you wouldn't find anything wrong with this, but because, okay, you have built this app, the point of the app is actually to ensure law and order, so the police will use it to try and check suspicious people moving around, and so there's nothing in the app itself that is biased, but okay, maybe the odd policeman, has a prejudice against Muslims or against, people of a certain class, but you can always deal with that by training him or giving him or her, lessons. Whereas this broader idea of equality goes much beyond that and looks at the systemic presumptions and biases that underlie the police force, the criminal justice system, and asks how that links to what the app is doing. And so of course, if you ask those questions at the beginning, thinking about what this app will do, what your goals are, what your purposes are, then you may end up designing something different. What you would do, obviously, I can't tell because that's not my area of expertise. But if those ideas are in your mind when you're starting off, as opposed to at the end of the process, then you may find that the design is something else that takes into account all these variables. You're still talking about, in the police example, you're still talking about a more conscious bias in the police force, but it might be even more subtle and even more nuanced. So one thing that's on the radar right now is the DNA bill, which talks about DNA data banks and having a data bank of criminal suspects. So what this the proposed law does, for example, is that it says that if you're convicted of an offense, then your data will be stored permanently in the data server and in the DNA data bank. And if you're the trial going on, then there's something more. But even if you're a suspect of a crime, right, still the police can take your DNA and put it in the data bank. Now again, coming back to the whole idea of how the criminal justice system substantially overrepresents certain sections of the population in prison, even as under trials without being convicted, you will then find by extension that the data bank will then have a disproportionate number of people belonging to those communities whose privacy will be violated, who will be subject to the possibility of false matches in the data bank and so on. So in the US, they actually found that because the DNA data banks disproportionately had the DNA of certain communities, the risks of false positives and therefore of false convictions exponentially rose for those communities. And so again, you may think you're working on a DNA data bank, but if you see the chain of causation, you will find that it leads to consequences that you wouldn't even imagine when you're working on the bank itself, because those aren't necessarily in your mind, because what you're working on is just making that data bank as good as it can be. And so I think that at the very beginning of the process, thinking about these constitutional values and principles and how they would impact the project at all its stages would go a long way towards thinking about issues of design. Often these would require having difficult conversations with people that are not always immediately within your immediate context. So I remember that at the whole time of the Aadhaar debate, there's a person called Bezwara Wilson. Some of you might know him. He runs this organization called the Safai Karamchari Andolan, and for the last 30 years he has been involved in the fight against manual scavenging. So as you know, throughout India we still have this practice, technically outlawed, but it's still very much there. And he has been fighting for the rights of people who are forced into manual scavenging for many years. Now, he was one of the strongest opponents of Aadhaar, and his reasons were reasons that I, coming from a very different background, couldn't understand fully back then, and I still don't understand completely myself. So he said, and he wrote an article, and it's online and you can read it. So he said, he was talking about how certain schemes that were specifically targeted at the community of manual scavengers required mandatory production of Aadhaar in order to avail of those benefits. And he said that this whole process is essentially fixing us in a particular identity as manual scavengers. And all our lives we have been trying to escape that, to move beyond that. And now this mandatory production of Aadhaar to get those schemes essentially locks us into that identity, makes us, thinks of us as being fixed there in that position. And we want to, go out of that. So we don't want this whole idea of one nation, one identity that the government is pushing. We don't want that, because identity for us is not a source of pride. And we are trying to leave that behind, and you aren't letting us do that. And I couldn't understand it back then fully, and as I said, I still can't quite figure out what that means in concrete terms. Maybe if I spoke more with him and listened more to him, I could understand more where he's coming from. But clearly you're talking about a person here who's really been in that field for many, many years, and who has an objection to this particular piece of tech that requires a lot of listening and understanding to even grasp for those of us who have never been in that position. Much more basic issue, of course, was that a person who is homeless, doesn't have a permanent address, had particular problems in getting an Aadhaar. Now, if at the time of designing it, at the time of asking those questions, people who have never had to deal with what homelessness means, and there's no reason why you should be thinking about those issues, but there are real issues that then come up after it's all done and it's too late to, and then all you have are little fixes here and there, which actually again shows you that the issues of constitutional design are really important at all stages of thinking about these projects. And I think again Eubanks has the best statement on this, and I'll just quote from there. She says that when automated decision making tools are not built to dismantle structural inequalities, their speed and scale intensifies them. And I'm just thinking back about something that Nilekani said way back: move fast and break things. Ultimately, you're not just breaking things, you're breaking people as well. And that's something I think which is very important to remember, because the point Eubanks is making is that what tech brings is speed and scale. And if you have those fault lines which I've talked about, the speed and the scale then tends to intensify them, unless you're thinking about how to actually undermine them and mitigate them. So what is to be done, and I'll close with that, with just an idea. In some countries and now among some scholars, they have developed what they call technological self-determination. It's a big series of words, but basically the idea is that at all points of time, individuals should have the right to decide for themselves how they will engage with a particular technological system or a piece of technology. They should have the power and the ability to decide on what terms they will bring that tech into their lives, and on what terms they will engage with it, and they may choose not to engage at all, and that's fine. They don't have to engage with it. Because again, I'm coming back to again something else that Nilekani said. He said once that if you don't have Aadhaar, then you will lose the right to have rights. And that's again a very telling statement, because the right to have rights comes from Hannah Arendt. And it comes from the idea that in any political community, you have citizens, and citizenship is marked by the fact that you are a person who has the right to access all those rights of equality, of free speech, and so on. On the other hand, if you're not a citizen, then you lose even the right to access those basic rights. And that fundamental distinction is what has been responsible for much of the oppression that we have seen over the last century. And so technological self-determination tries to bring that concept into play, and tries to set out a very abstract and basic idea about the link between constitutional values and principles on the one hand, and tech on the other. So I'll close with that, and I guess open it up for discussion and questions. So it's so.